This is a presentation from the Waupaca Historical Society.
Good evening, all. Can you hear me okay? All right. First, I'd like to ask, are there any Ho-Chunk or Ho-Chunk-related people in the crowd? Any Potawatomi? Any Menomonie? Okay, great. I also need to make a quick statement here. I do not work for the Menomonie tribe. I'm not paid by the Menomonie tribe, but I am going to talk quite a bit about the Menomonie tribe tonight. And I was asked to talk about Chief Waupaca after I happened to make a few comments a number of years ago in Waupaca about my doubts of the existence of Chief Waupaca. I realize this is a tough crowd in Waupaca, but this is also the perfect place to kind of talk about these kind of stories and myths and how they grow, what the origin is, and whether or not we can believe them and buy into them. And I think you can make your own decisions at the end of the night, but I think that I can make a pretty good case that Chief Waupaca is a good story, maybe even a great story, but it's still a fictional story. What we have on the screen now, many of you are familiar with this location, Chief Waupaca Historical Society, over towards Marion. You may even be familiar with the Chief Waupaca sign from 1926 that not only misspells Potawatomi, but it's a stretch that someone named Waupaca would be Potawatomi. There's also obviously a picture of the chief on the lakes here. Next slide, please. So this is the sign in question, and this sign has raised a lot of eyebrows in the Native community across Wisconsin. And for those of us who have worked as historians or archaeologists in Wisconsin, this raises even more questions. And I will state that this is not the only state historical society marker that seems to have been completely invented by somebody in medicine. Really hard to track down facts to back this up. I'm not saying that there weren't Potawatomi individuals living in what is now Waupaca County. I'm not, in fact, even saying that somebody named Sam Waupaca once lived here and had several kids. I strongly doubt that he and his sons and his stepson and 16 other individuals are interred on this spot. I can tell you that in the early part of the 20th century, it was really popular to create or embellish myths about natives who had been in the area in the past. And especially when a chief died, it seemed like there were very few tribal members who weren't chiefs, so it's a little confusing. Also, some of you may or may not know that most Midwestern tribes, certainly most Wisconsin tribes, never had a single traditional chief. They had band leaders, they had clan leaders. They were not chieftains, and they did not have chiefs. Chiefs were actually a title commonly given to individuals by the federal government so that they could negotiate with that individual, cut a land deal, write a treaty. But in fact, chief was never a title that was used, and certainly with the Menomonie, the idea of a chief even is at odds with the way their government is constructed. Everything in the Menomonie tribe is done by consensus. It's a little hard to believe, but in fact, no one individual in the Menomonie tribe has more power or more influence than anyone else in the tribe. I can also say, when you hear a myth about a chief being buried with his horse, or near his horse, or died on his horse, I'm always really skeptical. We've never recovered a single Native American burial with a horse in Wisconsin. In fact, I don't know of any recovery anywhere in North America of a single Native American with a horse. I know this is a common myth, we see it a lot. I can't say I've worked on plenty of archaeological sites where we recovered Native American burials. I've actually worked on sites where we've recovered horses, but there's no connection between the two. The Menomonie actually believe that out at this historical site near Marion, there may actually be a Menomonie woman buried here. According to oral history, there is a Menomonie woman buried here. They're quite unsure if there's any Potawatomi buried with her, and there's certainly no clan leaders and or chiefs buried here. Next slide. So let's start with taking a look at a couple of older maps. The map on the left is undated, but it's certainly post 1831. 1831 is the date that the Oneida and the Stockbridge Munsee were pushed out of New York and moved to Wisconsin. And you can see clearly on the hand-drawn map that it says Menominees, and then beneath them Oneida and Munsees. The common myth on the street is that the Menomonie were very gracious, and of course they allowed their red brothers from the east to come to Wisconsin and take up reservation lands. In fact, it was done at gunpoint, basically, with the federal government. The Menominees were really reluctant to release this land, and they sent a large contingent of clan leaders to Washington to actually lobby on behalf of the Menomonie tribe and not have these eastern tribes move in. The map on the right is an interesting map. It was created by the Menomonie Clans Project, which was a project at UWSP back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. This is a map of Menomonie land cessions, lands that the Menominees were forced to give up via treaty at various times during the 1800s. And I want you to start with taking a close look at the circle in the middle of the map. On the west side, you'll see ceded lands assumed to be included from the 1848 treaty. So the Menomonie have never agreed to cede these lands, but the federal government, and this is in documents going all the way back to 1848, the federal government says that it assumes those lands would be included. The other area is the 1848 ceded lands, which interestingly were not defined until 1959. So that's 111. Are there any attorneys in the room before I mention this? That's 111 years for the attorneys to sort out who said what in 1848. But I will point out the rectangle in Waupaca County. Waupaca County was part of the land cession in 1848. That might sound like a memorable date. That's the date Wisconsin became a state. Same year, the Menomonie ceded all of that territory. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the Menomonie tribe owned vast territory all the way across Wisconsin. They didn't just own a little rectangle now known as Menomonie County. Next map, please. Next slide. Here's another couple of maps, again, land cessions that slightly different boundaries, but basically the same story. They talk about what happened when. The Waupaca area was not ceded by the Menomonie until 1848. That's actually pretty late in the game. But there's a series of maps that predate 1848 that show what was going on in Waupaca County, Wood County, Waushara County, Portage County. Those maps clearly show Euro-American sawmills all over the place. So there were Euro-Americans here cutting logs and milling logs well before the lands were ever ceded by the Menomonie. The first European farm field that was broken in Waupaca County was in 1849. Waupaca County was officially platted in 1851. And by 1860, the chain of lakes was already a tourist destination. It was already being advertised. People were coming from mainly from the East Coast and from the South to come to the chain of lakes. So there was already kind of a thriving narrative and tourist business around the chain of lakes. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to go through a couple of, not chief, but Menomonie clan leaders who were painted by George Catlin in 1831. And these are individuals who were influential members of the Menomonie tribe, but they're clan leaders, they're not chiefs. So again, they're influential, but they don't have more to say, or they don't have an outsized impact on a decision more than any other tribal member. This is grizzly bear, and he was one of the strongest proponents against having the Oneida and the Stockbridge-Munsee come to Wisconsin. He wasn't really opposed to them coming to Wisconsin, but he didn't think it was right that after Menomonie had already signed off on nearly 4 million acres of land that they had to again give what they had, part of what they had left, these eastern tribes. He felt like there might be a better place in the state for them. Interestingly, the Menomonie tribe are the only tribe in Wisconsin, and we have 11 recognized tribes and 1 unrecognized tribe in Brotherton. But out of those 11 recognized tribes, only 1 tribe has an origin story in Wisconsin. All the rest of the tribes have migration stories. Talk about the fact that they came from somewhere else to Wisconsin. The Menomonie actually believe they emerged out of the ground in spring at the mouth of the Menomonie River on Green Bay. Along with the Ho-Chunk, just the Ho-Chunk and the Menomonie, those are the only 2 tribes with any claim to antiquity in the state. We know from archaeological record that both the Ho-Chunk and Menomonie had probably been on the landscape at least 1,000 years in Wisconsin, maybe a bit more. All of the other tribes were relative latecomers. There may have been some Ojibwa in northern Wisconsin as early as 500 years ago, but we're unsure about that. So in terms of all the other tribes, the Ho-Chunk and the Menomonie are the ones you want to consider when you think about burial mounds or prehistoric archaeological sites. Those are almost always ancestral Ho-Chunk or Menomonie. The Potawatomi, and again the sign clearly states that Sam Waupaca was a Potawatomi. The Potawatomi, along with the Ojibwa, were driven out of Michigan by the Iroquois. And they were driven north up to Sault Ste. Marie, maybe as early as 1500. Slowly they filtered down into Wisconsin. We know that the first Potawatomis of record were recorded in about 1630. And now we get a little bit into Menominee language. I'm not fluent in Menominee, but I do speak a tiny little bit of Menominee. And so I'm going to be throwing a bunch of Menominee terms out this evening. But the name for Waupaca is a little bit of a mispronunciation. And I'm not going to beat up on Waupaca. What I will say is that most Native American place names were recorded by interpreters who were not from that tribe. So it could be that an Ojibwa interpreted the name of this place where we're sitting tonight to the British or the French, but he spoke Ojibwa, he didn't speak Menominee. And so it could be that there's a little inflection, or something was lost in translation, but the original Menominee name for this place is Waupaca. And I'll talk about the meaning of that word in just a little bit. And then we're also going to talk about the chain of lakes. Sisekekigwi is the name of the chain of lakes. And that name literally means sprawling expanse of water, like an animal lying on its back, basking in the sun. So like many indigenous place names, they're very descriptive. So chain of lakes sounds pretty short compared to that name. And also, Waupaca County sits right in the middle of what we now recognize as Menominee traditional lands. And these were lands that we know were occupied by the Menominee at least 500 years ago, and based on the mound roots around the chain, I would strongly argue Menominees have been here for 1,000 years. Next slide, please. This is another clan representative. This is the wife of Grizzly Bear, Wounded Bear Shoulder. She also traveled to Washington to lobby on behalf of the Menominees. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's unlikely that Chief Waupaca ever existed, an individual named Chief Waupaca. I'm not going to say that there could not have been someone named Sam Waupaca who was a Potawatomi who did live somewhere on the chain of lakes. The truth is the Potawatomi are really closed-mouthed about this. They will neither confirm nor deny that somebody named Sam Waupaca might have lived here. But Waupaca, it's not a person's name. It's a toponym. It's a place name. It's a name that never would have been given to a person. Everything about the name Waupaca is descriptive, and it's not a person's name or a name that would have been used to describe a person. It's a description of what the morning light looks like on the water. So it's really kind of a beautiful name. It literally translates as first light on the water. Also, place of tomorrow is seen clearly. Wapa in Menomonie means light, and Wapan means very first light of the day, very first light when the dawn breaks. Wapasepe translates as first light river, or tomorrow river, or Waupaca river. Siskapewinwi, chain of lakes, translates, as I said, sprawling water like an animal stretched out and basking in the sun. Next slide. So here's an name you'll recognize, Shawano. So the city of Shawano is named after Shawano, which literally is a cardinal direction from Menomonie, but it's also a family name, a clan name. So Shawano traveled to Washington as well in 1831, and I pulled together a really short list of place names that you're probably going to recognize. These are all cities in Wisconsin. Every one of these is a Menomonie name. Appleton means watches for them place. Algoma is Menomonie for snowshoe. Asherton is a raccoon in Menomonie. My very favorite is Milwaukee. Some misfortune happened here. And we can go down the list. This is a very short list of Menomonie place names in the state, but it's sort of fascinating for me as an archaeologist to look at this kind of stuff. I will throw in one caveat. I'm a geoarchaeologist, and I typically focus on stuff 13 to 14,000 years ago. So to give a talk on late historic stuff is a bit of a stretch, but bear with me here. Next slide. This is what's known as the Menomonie Place Names Map. And I was extremely privileged back in 2013 and for several years prior to that to work with Menomonie elders and produce the first indigenous place names map in Wisconsin. This is also one of the very first native place name maps in all of North America. And this is a map of Wisconsin with Menomonie place names on it. So we name rivers, we name lakes, we name locations, we name sugar camps. And this wasn't just a whim. This was based on information that a colleague and dear friend, Mike Hoffman, his Menomonie name is Chicanaquat, and Chicanaquat means meteor cloud that makes it clear. So if it's really cloudy and a meteor comes across the sky, it tends to burn out all the clouds, and it's sort of a metaphor for understanding things in your life. So Mike passed away in 2019, but he and I managed to produce this map, and we really produced it as a Menomonie language tool for Menomonie kids. Most Menomonie kids don't realize that they once occupied the entire state of Wisconsin. They think that the Menomonie tribe has always been on this rectangle called Menomonie County. So we produced this map as sort of a teaching aid, but it's useful in the conversation tonight about Chief Waupaca. The name of this area that we now call Wisconsin may actually derive from the Menomonie word, which is Wiskosek. So Wiskosek literally means this is a place that has everything you need in it to live well. That's what Wiskosek means. Next slide. On the previous map, you may have seen two areas called out. We called out two areas in the state because they really were dense with Menomonie names. One of them is Menomonie County. Many of you will recognize this. This is the chain of lakes. These are all Menomonie names for various lakes. Again, you can see what the entire chain was called, but some of these are not unusual, right? Some will ring a bell. Otter Lake, Government Island in Menomonie, it's Sugar Island. Rainbow Lake is Old Woman's Lake. My favorite is Hoffman Lake, an abundance of muskrats. Was a nami name for that lake. And also Emmons Lake. Emmons Lake is shaped like the sacred double ball game played by women. So again, really descriptive names for places. But what I want you to understand is when you see this depth and this intensity of place names, it really makes you understand that these people were on the landscape for a very long time. And then when other tribes and Euro-Americans moved in, they probably picked up the existing place names. Next slide. Now I'm going to jump away from talking about Waupaca for a little while. I don't want to beat on Chief Waupaca for the entire night. So I'm going to offer a couple other local cases that are interesting to me. So if you remember, or if you're familiar with the sign near Marion that talks about Chief Waupaca being buried there, one of his sons was named Shapadoc. And so I did a little research on the name Shapadoc, and it does come up as a possible Potawatomi name. And then I ran across these two very interesting articles. So in the Waukesha Daily Freeman from December 26, 1931, it says, Indian ritual is held in Cutler Park. Cutler Park is a prehistoric mound group in the city of Waukesha. Held in honor of Chief Waukesha. Note he was buried here in the mounds with his horse, of course, and his two wives. I put an asterisk there because the newspaper actually uses a term that's very degrading and no longer accepted by Native Americans anywhere in North America, so I swapped it out for whites here. What's interesting to me is the first notice is published on December 26th. 2 days later, they publish a retraction. Chief Waukesha not buried here. And this is not really too surprising because these headlines were really common all across the state. You know, almost every town had a chief buried on a standing horse somewhere in town. If you didn't, you were a pretty pathetic town. But Waupaca, now called Waukesha, is actually a Menomonie word. Wako is fox, Waukesha means little fox. And this is a well-known Menomonie place name. Next slide. To their credit, Waukesha County Historical Society corrected this misappropriation of the mounds in 1959. So they put up a sign trying to correct the earlier language that had been used. They still didn't get it quite right. So, you know, in their prehistoric Indian mound signage, they talk about the fact that woodland Indians likely came into the state 2,000 years ago. As an archaeologist, I'm just totally scratching my head because Native Americans were present and living on the landscape in Wisconsin 10,000 years before that. Did they leave, go down to Chicago, come back up at the 2,000 year mark? So that's not quite right. Native Americans never left the state. It's not that Native Americans didn't move in and out of the state. They absolutely did. But the sign is a little off. Woodland Indians are a homegrown tradition. You know, they're Native Americans born, raised, died here in Wisconsin. And a little aside on Native American burial mounds. The state of Wisconsin is burial mound central. We have more burial mounds, geometric, conical, and linear mounds, and effigy mounds than the whole rest of the globe. Not just the rest of North America, the whole rest of the globe. And most of the burial mounds in Wisconsin are between 800 and 1,100 years old. That really predates that 1630 date for Potawatomis. Next slide. Now I'm going to jump over to Oshkosh himself. Most of you are familiar with Oshkosh or Chief Oshkosh, Chief Oshkosh beer. The name's been used for lots of things. Oshkosh isn't his name. Oshkosh is his name. Oshkosh means his claw. He's a Menomonie Bear Clan leader. And he was someone who lobbied heavily not to sell or lose Menomonie lands by a treaty. As the State Historical Society notes, Chief Oshkosh died in 1858, 10 years after Wisconsin became a state, and his life was a testament to the Menomonie people to forever stay on their ancestral lands. Unfortunately, all of the ancestral lands were basically taken out from under the Menomonie. And this is not an unusual story, right? Also, Chief Oshkosh, really Oshkosh, and again, not a chief, had this photo taken the same time he had the painting done by Brooks in 1854. He hated this hat. This was not his hat. This was a hat that was given to him by a photographer, and then every painting and image after that shows him in his top hat. Next slide. So some of you may be familiar with Indian Park in the city of Oshkosh. Is anybody familiar with that? So Indian Park is reportedly where Oshkosh is buried. And in 1911, an Italian sculptor presented this statue to the city of Oshkosh. It's supposed to be a representation of Oshkosh himself. This guy doesn't look much like a Menomonie, and he sure doesn't look like Oshkosh. In fact, he looks a little Italian. Next slide. This is the plaque on the statue. Oshkosh, a chief of the Menomonie tribe of Indians, whose greatest achievement in this life was in giving to this city the name which will make it famous while one stone remains upon another. The Menomonie tribe had been trying for the last 2 years to get the signage changed in Indian Park. They have lobbied really hard that this signage has nothing to do with reality. They really want to straighten out the story now. And as of a city meeting not that long ago, they were recently turned down again. But his claw died a broken man after he had been forced to first sign away about 4 million acres and eventually sign away 7 million acres of traditional Menomonie lands. And the plaque went up 75 years after he passed away. His greatest achievement, actually, and this is directly from Menomonie tribal elders, is that he was able to keep federal troops from invading Menomonie camps at gunpoint all across Menomonie territory. I mean, this was really forced dislocation for the tribe. They did not want to give these lands up. And the city of Oshkosh now occupies what was at one time a Menomonie fish camp. Next slide. And here we have, interestingly, a headstone, or rather a footstone, really, that talks about Chief Oshkosh being here. So this sort of rings some bells, right? Chief Waupaca, Chief Oshkosh. They're both Menomonie. They're both supposedly buried in these locations. Oshkosh is not buried here. There's also a 1911 paper that talks about how delighted the Menominees are that they're going to be able to disinter their revered clan leader up in Kashina and bring him down and bury him in the city of Oshkosh. In fact, it never happened. It's all myth. The Menomonie Nation says that Oshkosh is happily buried in Kashina. And again, recent efforts by the Menomonie to correct this and rewrite the signage were voted down by a committee for Indian Park as recently as about 2 months ago. Next slide. This is a little further afield. This is over in Wood County. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Mead wildlife area, a vast, extensive marsh set aside as a federal wildlife area. This is a mentor and my predecessor as an archaeologist at UWSP, John Moore, back when we were doing extensive excavations on Smoky Hill. So at the time, we were interested in a French battle, which allegedly took place on Smoky Hill. It's called the Battle of Smoky Hill. It apparently took place in 1748 when Wisconsin was still part of New France. And the story came down by word of mouth, and it was first written down in 1906. And it was published in a Marshfield paper called The News. And what they state in the article is the Ho-Chunk and the Ojibwa fought each other, and the Ojibwa were aided by the French. And the French apparently came from a garrison in Green Bay and brought 2 full-size cannons across the state and then through the swamp at the Mead Wildlife Area. And so if you've ever been out over there, think about hauling 2 cannons through that swamp. Extensive searches of French documents, including what are called the Jesuit relations, kind of mandated field notes that were done by the Jesuits when they came into North America. There is not a single mention of the French leaving Green Bay, certainly not leaving Green Bay with cannons, and certainly never going to Wood County. In fact, what the archaeologists think happened, and the Ojibwa people up at Lac de Flambeau say this is absolutely the case. The battle was actually fought at Strawberry Island up near Lac de Flambeau, and the French weren't involved. It was between the Ojibwe and the Lakota Sioux. And some of you may or may not realize that the Lakota Sioux were Great Lakes people, and they were pushed out of the Great Lakes and finally pushed out of Wisconsin. And this is one of the very last battles when the Sioux were pushed out of the state of Wisconsin. And the Lac de Flambeau happily purchased the island back from a private party in 2013. They were forced to sell the island about 150 years ago for $200. They tried to get it back for $200, but it cost them a little more. Next slide. I should also say, back up if you would, that UWSP did multiple field schools and extensive excavations on Smoky Hill. And although we recovered lots of 20th century pieces of farm equipment and an awful lot of prehistoric Native American artifacts, there is absolutely no evidence of French, what are called grenades, small, little incendiary bombs. If you think about, this is the right crowd, so if you think of Rocky and Bullwinkle and you think about holding a bomb with a wick on it, right? Okay, French grenades, it's a cast iron, hollow cast iron ball filled with gunpowder with a wick sticking out of a hole on it. And you would light it and you would put it in a rifle and then you would hope the rifle would go off. That's what we expected to find at this site because we have excavated sites around Oshkosh where those French grenades and cannonballs actually occur. We never found any evidence at all on Smoky Hill. The French simply were not there. Next slide. Now a little closer to home, Manawa. There's another local myth published in the Manawa Advocate in 1890, and it talks about the origin of the name of the city of Manawa. And it talks about 2 Ho-Chunk chiefs, of course, they had to be chiefs. One of them, the younger, apparently better looking and much beloved individual was named Manawa. And the tale describes how these 2 chiefs really did not like each other. They were competing for who would run the tribes or the bands around the area on the Little Wolf that's now called Manawa. They were both bragging about how good they were with a bow. And they stood on either side of the Little Wolf River and they shot at each other with bows and arrows. And sadly, the bad guy won. Manawa, the good-looking guy, had his bowstring cut, was never able to actually loose an arrow, and was shot in the heart, died, and was buried on the spot with his horse. It's interesting that so many of these chiefs with a horse died, and that's how the town got its name, but I included Manawa because it's just so close to Waupaca. Next slide. So, in closing here, Waupaca, or more correctly, Waupaca, is a toponym. It's a place name. It's not an individual's name. Menomonie presence in the area goes back roughly 1,000 years, and that clearly predates any Potawatomi or Ojibwa claims in the area. There's an extensive list of proto-historic Menomonie place names that argue for Waupaca, as a long-held descriptive name, well prior to Potawatomi presence after 1650 or so in this part of the state. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of historic signs either put up, and I'm not going to pick on specific agencies, but both the DNR and the State Historical Society and different state agencies have at time produced really poorly researched signage, and some of those have now been corrected, some as yet have not. And they really reflect kind of misunderstandings, cross-cultural misunderstandings or perceptions about what was happening when Euro-Americans came into the state. Also, it's interesting to me that the name Chief Waupaca never shows up in the historic record. You know, there are lots and lots of Menomonie band leaders and clan leaders listed early on. They were well recognized. The Menomonie were aligned with the French. They were very reluctant to work with the British when the British came in. But in all of those historic records, there is no Chief Waupaca until tourism starts in town here. And then suddenly the town gains a Chief Waupaca. Next slide. I just want to mention that, you know, what I know about Menomonie culture all came from this guy, Mike Hoffman. Mike was incredibly knowledgeable. He learned Menomonie at a very young age from elders. He was a Menomonie language teacher, again, one of the last fluent Menomonie speakers. And when I say one of the last, there may be 5 left, if 5. There is a real effort to have intensive Menomonie language classes on the reservation now to teach kids their own language, but it's an uphill battle. Mike was a cultural advisor to what was called the Menomonie Clan Story, which is a long-time exhibit at Stevens Point and is now on exhibit at the Oshkosh Public Museum. He was a mentor and a friend, a language teacher, a colleague, and a phenomenal traditional archer. Not only was Mike really good at getting white-tailed deer every single year, he got a black bear almost every other year. Next slide. While waiting, that's just Menomonie for thank you. Thank you.